If your hair turned gray while you were still in school or in your early 20s, you probably heard the same explanations everyone gives. Too much stress, bad luck, bad genes. Nobody ever told you the real reason because, until recently, scientists themselves did not fully understand it. Those gray strands are not just a random quirk. They are connected to a specific chapter of human history, stretching back thousands of years before any country we know today even existed. When researchers finally mapped the genes behind early graying, they did not just find a detail about hair color. They found a marker, a biological fingerprint, that leads back to an ancient migration story almost nobody has heard. This is not really a story about hair. It is a story about where you come from. For a huge number of people with East Asian, Southeast Asian, South Asian, or mixed backgrounds, early graying traces back to population movements that happened long before recorded history began. This was never a hidden secret. It was simply the normal, messy process of history. People traveled, cultures blended, languages shifted and disappeared, written records vanished. But the DNA stayed exactly where it was, quietly passed down through every generation. We are going to walk through this step by step. The biology behind it, the ancient groups involved, the migrations that carried these genes across entire continents, and the research that finally uncovered the connection. If you want more videos like this, subscribe now, because we cover stories like this every week, the kind of history that gets buried and never resurfaces. Let's start with the basic biology, because you need to understand the mechanism before the ancestry part will make sense. The color of your hair comes down to melanin produced by cells called melanocytes that live at the root of every hair follicle. These cells make two kinds of pigment. One produces brown and black shades, the other produces red and yellow tones. The balance between the two decides your natural hair color. But here's the real question. What decides whether those melanocyte cells keep functioning for decades or shut down early? That comes down to a gene known as IRF4, short for interferon regulatory factor 4. This gene came into focus after a 2018 study published in Nature Communications, which looked at genetic data from more than 6,000 people across Latin America. It was the first large genome study to treat hair graying as its own trait worth studying directly, rather than a side note in other research. When the results were analyzed, IRF4 stood out as the single strongest genetic factor linked to graying before age 30. What made this even more interesting is that the specific version of IRF4 tied to early graying was not spread evenly across the world. It showed up far more often in people with indigenous American ancestry, in East Asian and Southeast Asian populations, and in mixed groups with historical ties to those regions. European populations carried a different version entirely. South Asian populations had yet another pattern. This told scientists something important. Early graying did not appear just once in human history. It appeared independently in different places, shaped by different ancestral backgrounds. So the real question becomes, which ancestral background and how far back does it go? That is where things get genuinely fascinating. This genetic story runs alongside a much bigger scientific debate, one about who actually settled the Asian continent first and when. For most of the last century, the accepted theory was simple. A single wave of migration left Africa, moved through South Asia, and eventually spread north into East Asia. Under that model, every East Asian population was basically one group that slowly diversified over tens of thousands of years in the same place. That theory has since been overturned. Once genome sequencing became affordable enough to use at scale after around 2016, ancient DNA research exploded, revealing something far more complicated. East and Southeast Asia were populated by several distinct waves of migration, not just one. Some early groups left no descendants at all. Others mixed heavily with later arrivals. And some left genetic traces specific enough that scientists can still trace them today, using markers connected to traits like early graying. In 2019, researchers from Harvard, the Max Planck Institute, and several universities in China published ancient DNA results pulled from more than 200 individuals, spanning 10,000 years of history across East and Southeast Asia. The people living in southern China, Vietnam, and Thailand more than 4,000 years ago were genetically very different from the people living there today. Instead, they were more closely related to groups like the Andaman Islanders and certain indigenous communities in the Philippines and Malaysia, remnants of a much older layer of human settlement. Then, somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 years ago, a major population expansion began out of the Yangtze River Basin, spreading south and southwest. These groups spoke early forms of what would become the Austroasiatic and Austronesian language families. They were farmers, carrying crops like rice, taro, and millet, along with specific genes, including pigmentation variants that affected how long melanocyte cells kept working. As these farming populations spread outward, they did not simply wipe out the people already there. In some regions, they mixed almost completely. In others, only partially. The result was a patchwork of populations across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, each carrying a different blend of ancient genetic material and newer farming era genetics. The early graying trait tends to concentrate along the exact route of this expansion, not because it gave anyone an advantage, but because it happened to travel along with other genes carried by these expanding populations. This process is known as genetic hitchhiking, one of the reasons certain traits become useful as ancestry markers, even when the trait itself never mattered for survival. Now here is where the story becomes personal for a lot of people. If you have Chinese ancestry, particularly from southern provinces such as Guangdong, Fujian, Yunnan, or Guangxi, and you gray early, there's a good chance your genetic thread runs through a group known as the Baiyue. The Baiyue were non-Han peoples who lived across much of southern China long before the Han Empire expanded into the region. The name roughly translates to the 100 Yue, a broad label for dozens of different tribal groups that shared farming traditions and genetic backgrounds different from populations further north. The Baiyue spoke early versions of languages that would eventually branch into the Tai-Kadai, Austroasiatic and Proto-Austronesian families. Some of their descendants became the Zhuang people of Guangxi. Others became ancestors of the Vietnamese, the Lao, and the Thai. Some migrated out across the water entirely, eventually becoming ancestors of Taiwanese indigenous peoples, Filipinos, Malays, and various Pacific populations. A 2021 study in the journal Cell Research confirmed that most Southeast Asian populations today carry a blend of this ancient Baiyue-related layer combined with later waves of migration from the north. Vietnamese populations carry more of the older Austroasiatic component. Thai and Lao populations carry more Tai-Kadai-related ancestry. Filipino and Indonesian populations carry Austronesian ancestry tracing back to Taiwan roughly 4,000 years ago. And running through all of these groups in different proportions but consistently present are the exact pigmentation gene variants linked to early graying. So if you are Vietnamese, Thai, Filipino, Malay, Zhuang, Lao, Javanese, or from any of the dozens of related communities across Southeast Asia, and your hair went gray early, the biological path almost certainly leads back to this ancient movement out of southern China. You are carrying a genetic signature from people who were farming along the Yangtze Delta long before the pyramids in Egypt were built. The South Asian side of this story runs just as deep, and it is arguably even less well known. If you have roots in South India, Sri Lanka, or Bangladesh, and you gray early, you are looking at a related but distinct genetic thread. South Asia has one of the most layered population histories on Earth, shaped by at least 3 major waves of mixing stacked on top of each other across 10,000 years. The oldest layer descends from the original migration out of Africa into South Asia, somewhere between 50 and 65,000 years ago. Geneticists call this group the Ancient Ancestral South Indians, or AASI. Their strongest genetic legacy shows up today in tribal communities across South India, Sri Lanka, and the Andaman Islands. The second layer arrived from the west, brought by Neolithic farmers from what is now Iran around 8,000 to 9,000 years ago, mixing with the populations already there to form what geneticists call the Indus Valley ancestry component. The third major layer arrived from the Central Asian steppe around 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, mixing heavily with the populations already formed from that earlier blend. The IRF4 variants linked to early graying show up at noticeably higher frequencies in populations, carrying larger proportions of that original AASI ancestry. This mirrors the pattern in Southeast Asia, where the early graying signal concentrates in populations with the deepest roots in the pre-farming layer of history. For South Asian early grayers, the signal may point directly back to the very first humans who settled the subcontinent, predating every civilization we know by name. Now let's talk about why early graying shows up so much more often in certain mixed ancestry communities than researchers originally expected. When 2 populations that both carry similar variants of the same gene mix together, the offspring do not necessarily land somewhere in the middle. Sometimes the trait actually gets amplified. IRF4 and related genes work through dosage effects and complex interactions that do not simply add up in a straight line. In practice, this means people with mixed East Asian and Southeast Asian ancestry, or mixed Southeast Asian and South Asian ancestry, often gray earlier than either source population would on its own. This explains a pattern that surfaced a few years back in consumer DNA testing data. Mixed ancestry individuals of Asian background were reporting early graying at rates that surprised researchers, not because the trait had become more common, but because the mixing of ancestries was concentrating it in specific family lines. The Philippines is a great example. Filipino populations show some of the highest rates of early graying anywhere in Southeast Asia, and the genetic explanation tracks with the sheer complexity of Filipino ancestry. Indigenous Negrito populations represent some of the oldest human communities in island Southeast Asia, layered with Austronesian ancestry from Taiwan, and then further waves of mixing from southern China, the Indian subcontinent, Arabia, and Spain, across roughly 3,000 years of trade and colonization. When that many pigmentation gene variants stack across generations, early graying gets reinforced from multiple directions at once. The result is a population where going gray at 25 is not unusual in certain family lines. Those family lines are carrying a living record of every population that ever contributed to who they are. There is another angle to this story that rarely gets discussed, and it comes from what the ancient DNA record shows when plotted on a map. When researchers published new analyses of ancient DNA from sites across Southeast Asia, India, and southern China in 2022 and 2023, covering roughly 8,000 years, they kept finding the same surprising pattern. Ancient populations showed far more genetic diversity and distinction between neighboring groups than modern populations do in those same regions today. What happened in between? Massive gene flow, spread over thousands of years, gradually blended populations that had once been quite distinct, farming expansions, maritime trade networks, Bronze Age kingdoms, the spread of Hindu and Buddhist influence, disruptions caused by the Mongols, and the later expansion of Chinese imperial power into the south. Every one of these events moved people. Moving people moves genes, and moving genes moves traits along with them. The early graying signal is essentially a relic, a marker once tied to very specific ancient populations, carried forward as their descendants gradually blended into the wider mosaic of modern Asian populations. This is exactly why two cousins with nearly identical ancestry percentages can end up with completely different outcomes. One goes fully gray by 30, the other barely has a streak by 50. These variants sit on chromosome segments passed down almost randomly during inheritance. Whether you carry them may feel like chance, but the fact they exist in your family line at all is not chance. It is direct inheritance from people who lived in river deltas and mountain valleys across ancient Asia, thousands of years before their countries ever had names. Now let's talk about the diaspora side of this, because it is where the research becomes personally relevant for millions of people. There are large populations of Asian descent living across the United States, Australia, the United Kingdom, Canada, and Europe who have lost track of their exact ancestral origins. Generations of migration, assimilation, intermarriage, and in many cases war and displacement broke the chain of oral history and written records. For many of these families, early graying has quietly become a source of identity confusion, signaling a connection to something real while the story behind it has been lost. DNA testing has been both helpful and frustrating here. You can now get a rough ancestry breakdown that did not exist 20 years ago, but reference populations used by major testing companies remain weighted heavily toward European and increasingly East Asian ancestry, while other groups stay underrepresented. Southeast Asian populations, including Vietnamese, Filipino, Indonesian, Malay, Burmese, Cambodian, Lao, and Thai communities, are underrepresented in reference panels relative to their global population size. South Asian representation has improved but remains incomplete, and Pacific Islander populations remain dramatically underrepresented. In practical terms, someone with Filipino ancestry might get a result saying 60% Southeast Asian and Pacific Islander without the test breaking that down into components like Visayan, Igorot, Malay, or Southern Chinese ancestry, all lumped under one broad label. The early graying trait, combined with other genetic markers, is one of the tools population geneticists now use to break apart these broad reference categories and identify specific ancient population threads hiding underneath modern Southeast Asian and Pacific Islander diversity. In a real sense, people who gray early and go looking for answers about their Asian ancestry are not just passive subjects of this research. Their own biology is one of the data sources driving it forward. There's also a fascinating north-to-south gradient in early graying rates across East Asia. Populations in southern China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific consistently show higher rates than populations in northern China, Korea, and Japan, and even within China, the frequency steadily decreases moving north. This gradient lines up with what geneticists call the ancient Southern East Asian ancestry component, the genetic signature left by pre-farming populations who occupied the region before the Neolithic expansion. Where this component remains at higher levels, early graying shows up more often. Where it has been diluted by later migration from the north, early graying becomes less common. It is not a perfect correlation, since sun exposure and other genes also affect melanocyte function. But the pattern is consistent enough that researchers use it as evidence when reconstructing regional population history. What all of this tells us is that early graying is, in part, a biological record of which ancient populations contributed most heavily to your ancestry. The more of that ancient Southern Asian genetic layer you carry, the more likely you are to also carry the pigmentation variants responsible for early graying. Your hair is keeping score of an inheritance that stretches back to people who crossed land bridges, sailed across open water, and followed river valleys more than 10,000 years ago. The research on IRF4 does not stop at hair color. The same variants that affect how long melanocytes keep functioning also interact with the immune system, and some of those interactions are turning out to be medically significant. There are associations, though not proven direct causes, between the IRF4 variants linked to early graying and differences in immune function. That makes sense once you understand IRF4 is primarily an immune regulating gene, and hair pigmentation is really a secondary function of a gene mostly involved in shaping how the immune system develops and responds to threats. Some researchers have proposed that these variants reached high frequencies in Southern and Southeast Asian populations because they provided real immune advantages, not because of hair color. Tropical Asia has historically had some of the highest levels of pathogen diversity on Earth, and variants in IRF4 that improved immune response may have been strongly favored by natural selection, with early graying simply riding along as a side effect because the same gene influences both systems. If that idea holds up, early graying in Asian populations is not just a marker of ancestry. It may also be a trace of an ancient immune adaptation, the cost of carrying an immune system built for an environment your distant ancestors once lived in. That is a strikingly different way to think about something you may have spent years feeling self-conscious about. So here is what all of this actually means if you are sitting at home right now, running your fingers through gray strands of hair. If you have East Asian ancestry, whether Chinese, Japanese, Korean, or Taiwanese, and you gray early, you are most likely carrying Bayou-related ancestry, ancient Southern East Asian ancestry, or both. Generally, the earlier and more completely you gray, the higher the proportion of these ancient components you likely carry. If you have Southeast Asian ancestry, whether Vietnamese, Filipino, Thai, Malay, Indonesian, Cambodian, Lao, or Burmese, or from any of the hundreds of ethnic groups across the region, early graying points toward ancient Austroasiatic and Austronesian migration streams, possibly reaching back even further to hunter-gatherer populations that existed before those migrations began. If you have South Asian ancestry, whether Indian, Sri Lankan, Bangladeshi, or Nepali, early graying may point specifically toward AASI ancestry, the oldest genetic layer in South Asia, representing the very first humans to settle the subcontinent. If you have mixed Asian ancestry, early graying may be amplified through the combination of variants inherited from multiple ancestral lines, connecting you to several of these threads at once. And if your family background crosses the Asian-Pacific boundary, common among Filipino, Malay, Indonesian, and Pacific Islander families, your early graying may be linking you to one of the most remarkable genetic legacies in human history. The Austronesian expansion, a maritime migration that spread human populations from Taiwan to Hawaii and even to Madagascar over roughly 4,000 years, remains the largest maritime migration in all of human prehistory. That is genuinely extraordinary. And the fact that it left a visible trace in your own hair follicles is, scientifically speaking, remarkable. This whole conversation about early graying and Asian ancestry points toward something much bigger, a fundamental shift in how we understand where Asian populations actually come from. For most of the last century, the dominant way of thinking about this was national and ethnic, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, Filipino, Indian, treated as clean, separate categories with tidy historical origins. Genetics research over the last 15 years has completely overturned that. What we see instead is a continuous, overlapping mosaic of ancestral streams stretching back tens of thousands of years, connecting populations that modern political borders treat as completely separate. The people of coastal Vietnam and southeastern China share ancient ancestry, predating both of their modern nations by thousands of years. The people of the Philippines and Taiwan share a connection tracing back to the Austronesian expansion. The tribal communities of the Andaman Islands are genetic relatives of populations scattered across South Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific, a living record of the very first human settlement along the Asian coastline. Early graying offers a small window into this much larger picture, but it opens onto something genuinely profound. Your body carries a record of history that goes back further than any document, any monument, or any written language ever could, back to people who looked out at a shoreline or a river valley and decided to keep moving forward, back to populations that mixed, separated, and mixed again for tens of thousands of years before anyone ever wrote a single word of it down. The gray in your hair is not a sign of aging. It is a signature, a message passed down from people who lived, moved, and mixed together long before the world had the maps and borders we rely on today. And now, for the first time, we are finally starting to read it. If this is the kind of story that changes how you think about who you really are, go ahead and subscribe, because we release deep dives just like this every single week. Leave a comment and let us know where your family comes from and whether early graying runs in your own family line. If you want us to go even further into the IRF4 research, the ancient DNA studies, or the full story of the Austronesian expansion, tell us in the comments and we will build an entire episode around it. The story of where we all come from is longer, stranger, and far more connected than most of us were ever taught. We will keep telling it.